Welcome to today's webinar with the title, How to Design Effective Trigger Codes for Your EEG Study. Before I hand over to our speaker today, I want to make a few words to introduce how we will run this webinar. So at first, I want to introduce myself. My name is Alex Kreilinger. I'm a technical product manager with Brain Products, and I will be the moderator today. In the background, we have our colleagues Liam and Samantha, who will take care to make everything run smoothly. They will be responsible for everything technical in the background. And the speaker for today will be Dr. Shivakumar Viswanathan, in short Shiva, who has a lot of experience, more than 15 years in cognitive neuroscience research, EEG, fMRI, and a lot of other experimental and analysis methods.
My name is Shiva. I'm in the Education and Scientific Communications Department, and we organize the Brain Products Academy events here. This talk will be about designing effective trigger codes for your EEG study. And so let's get started. So to take it from the top, EEG is a method essentially to measure a neuroelectric activity on the scalp generated by the brain's functioning. And modern EEG acquisition involves like a large variety of specialized technologies to detect these signals on the scalp, to amplify and digitize them, and to record them without any loss of information. And when everything works and you have performed a successful acquisition, you should have a high time resolution EEG recording. Now, the key question is, when during analysis, the interest is in finding out what information it actually contains about the brain and what the person is actually doing. And a key requirement for this is context about what the person was doing during the recording. Were they awake, asleep? What specifically they were doing from moment to moment. And this is obviously crucial for analysis. And hardware triggers are a technology to bring context information into the EEG recording. So the basic agenda today to cover this large and fairly complex topic is to focus on specifically context information related to events and how they can be turned into markers in your EEG data. And here we will discuss 3 constraints on this communication, and I will discuss about how you can design ways to decide what to send and how this information is to be received. So our story starts with events. So the events are a crucial concept to bring context in EEG studies, and they are part of important paradigms such as the event-related potential approach to study neurocognition, as well as event-related spectral changes. So if you look here on the right, this is a classical ERP plot, and on the time axis you can see there is a 0 here, and this is typically indicating when a particular event happened and the changes in the potentials relative to this event. And this is the same when you look at, say, time frequency analysis. The 0 here often refers to changes, for example, in the oscillatory power, different frequencies relative to some event. So what is this event? What is an event? It's somewhat difficult to define explicitly, but a working definition is that it's a discrete happening related to the participant, and it's often defined by what happened and when. And to give you a concrete example, consider an experimental setup where participants see a stimulus on the screen, for example. The onset of the stimulus is an event. Something happened at a particular time, and the response that follows is also a particular event. And this is a very broad definition and can be applied in a variety of different ways. To give you some other examples, the instruction to close your eyes in a resting state is an event. The instruction to open eyes is also an event. the onset of EMG, or for example, when you're measuring peripheral physiology is an event, or like when a TMS pulse is delivered, or the movement onset and offset. So there's a huge variety of ways that events can be defined in a flexible way. So what is it that they bring to the analysis is that they help define the scope of effects. So to give you an example here on this experimental timeline, there are two trials. You say in a laterality task where participants have to judge whether the displayed hand is a left or right and make a response. Now, in the cognitive neural timeline of what the brain is actually doing, these two events provide a clear definition of when these processes that transform the stimulus into a response must take place. And similarly, when we consider the relationship to the continuous EEG recording, due to the close relationship in timing between brain activity and record EEG, despite all the spatial distortions, the events also help to identify relevant EEG activity. Now, events are an abstraction in a certain way. So the concrete representation of events in the EEG timeline are referred to as markers. And here's an example, like they're quite simplistically defined. For example, in the BrainVision core format, each marker is defined by a particular type or description of what it is, and position, which is really the time at which the marker occurs relative to when the EEG recording began. So accurate markers are crucial for data selection and aggregation. They form the basis for segmenting the data, that is for selecting which segments of the EEG data should be used, and for aggregation, that is to collect together segments relate to a particular event. This is obviously very crucial when there are many types of events in the experiment. And these are critical steps at the starting point that inform subsequent advanced analyses for ERPs and for other analyses that are based on events. So, and the quality of these markers directly impact the quality of the results obtained with these analyses. So why do we need triggers at all? Like, though I haven't mentioned this explicitly now. So, and the key issue has to do with a practical one, the configuration of the experiment. There are many devices involved in a typical experiment. And to make things, to organize them by their functional role, there's a cluster of events, a cluster of devices here. And you can see these are related to event control and detection, displaying a stimulus or like to collect responses. And even though the participant is involved in the same, there's another cluster related to the acquisition of the EEG involving the amplifier, for example, in the recording PC. And the key issue is how to get event information from this cluster of devices to the EEG data so that markers can be defined. And there are many solutions to this problem, and depending on your experiment and the technological characteristics involved. One approach is to perform this recording of event information during the experiment, and hardware triggers is an important strategy to this end. And so there are other software-based approaches such as the lab streaming layer as well, which I will not say much more about here today. And it's also possible to include the event information during analysis. And this can be done by using log files of all the events and incorporating it into the EEG data during analysis, or for example, using peripheral physiology signals during analysis to define events. So how are events? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how our event markers actually created using triggers. Due to the wide variability in how setups can be, we will use a general communication-based way of thinking about this. On the left is the sender, that is where the event information is obtained, and the message, the trigger signal is a message to send this information that is received by the EEG system. This is the receiver. And it's important to note that this is often sent to the EEG recording system and not to the recording PC, so that this can be integrated with the EEG data that is being acquired. So here's a simple animation. So there's a participant and there's just, they are viewing some colored squares and responding to them. These are the events that we would like to get into the EEG recording. And here's a schematic of all the steps that are involved here. Just a sketch of all the steps that involved in converting events into markers. And it's a little busy, so let's look at them step by step. The key step here is the encoding step, where based on the event that occurs, there is a trigger code associated with it. So for example, when a blue square is displayed, it's the associated code is this binary digit and a binary string. And now this is converted into a voltage pulses that are sent out from the computer's port. And this is all implemented in the background, often with your favorite experimental control software, in which there can be many. Once this is done, the message has to be transmitted, you make the journey from the sender's port to the receiving port. And this is where there is a lot of hardware often involved. And just to get a sense for where your knowledge of this is, here is a simple quiz for you to test your knowledge on the hardware related triggers, which is the typically preferred hardware for sending triggers. Okay, so it looks quite stable at this moment. All right, so for those who managed to get an answer in, this is the correct answer. The preferred hardware for sending triggers is a parallel port. HDMI and DVI ports are to communicate media like video and multimedia information. And in the animations, we saw the ones and zeros that were going together in parallel, and that's what parallel ports enable to do, and they allow you to get a lot of information quickly and at the same time to the other end. Serial ports can be used, but this is not the preferred strategy usually. Second question is, which of the following refers to a parallel port? There are so many names, and often it's good to know what they refer to because it's sometimes unclear. So an Ethernet port, COM port, or LPT, or a USB. Okay, so let's end and share the results. And the correct answer is actually the LPT port. So the Ethernet port is neither quite a serial port or a parallel port. The COM port is usually almost always a serial port, and the LPT port, which is like for line printer and often is not present in many modern computers or laptops, is the classical parallel port. USB, which no one selected correctly, is the universal serial bus, and the word serial appears in it as well. Let's move on. So how is this actually implemented? So this involves the circuits called the transistor logic, or TTL circuits that implement pulses, which basically have a simply high and a low level voltage, so that any noise in the voltage will not affect whether it's high or low. So it behaves like a binary signal. And there's a variety of different hardware to actually carry the information. And one of them, for example, is the trigger box that helps forwarding information depending on the ports you have available on your system. And there are different cables involved as well. And there's more information in the handout, which you can find under the Materials tab, and it should be on your upper right of the GoToWebinar interface. And it's very important to remember at this stage, pulses from other senders can also enter, so that the receiver can receive information from multiple sources and not just one. And once the voltage pulses reach the receiver, or typically the EEG recording system, the binary voltage pulses are now converted into markers, and this is done by the EEG recording software. And in this case, we will consider a BrainVision Recorder, which will essentially perform the conversion from the trigger code to the marker and write it into the EEG data. So this is just to give you an overview, but what's important is this captures the key information that needs to be sent between devices that is involved in when you're using hardware triggers. So first take home is, when you are starting up your experiments, it can be very valuable to create a trigger plan for your experiment. This looks like it's simply a table with information that summarizes all the information that is involved in the trigger. So to give you an example, you would fill it out with all the event types involved and the devices row by row. So for example, so you can trace the path from the event type, the device, to what trigger code you would like to send for this event type. And then you would specify, for example, how it is to be interpreted by BrainVision Recorder and the marker that you plan to get. So this is done as a planning process so that you can account for every event to marker rigorously. Why is this crucial? Even though you might be able to successfully send one trigger across, it's crucial to consider all of them together, because they can interfere in complex ways and there may be logical contradictions and conflicts involved. And it's important to consider them column-wise. One way to detect inconsistencies is to use this one-to-one criterion. That is, how do events turn to markers, but also to work backwards. If you knew a particular marker, can you reconstruct what event type sent it? And it's one-to-one is if you can go in both directions. Otherwise, it reveals the existence of ambiguities. And what makes filling out this trigger plan a little sometimes tricky is that there are some constraints, and I mentioned 3 of them, and I'll go through them step by step. And you need to take them into consideration and navigate them to find the solution that fits for your experiment. And importantly, the first constraint, which is marked as 0, is not about the information that is sent explicitly, and it is about timing. So the trigger codes actually contain information about what is sent, but not about the timing explicitly. And to give you a sort of easy way to think about this, consider this chicken laying an egg, which is an event, and then this triggers a series of little events that lead to the bulb turning on, which is like the marker. So this is like a mechanical trigger. And what you notice is that the sender time and the receiver time, depending, there is a latency involved between when the event occurs and when the marker is received. But if this latency is relatively constant, then when the lamp turns on, in this case, can be used to estimate when the egg was actually laid. So just by subtracting this latency. And in this way, time information is built into the hardware setup. And this is a crucial idea as well for the use of hardware triggers, where the event leads to triggers that are rapidly sent to the receiver. And when the latencies are very small and stable, and often they are, if you have a good setup, then the marker time, the receiver time, is an estimate, a very reasonable estimate of when the event occurred. So there is no need to share timestamps and stuff like that. But of course, making sure that these assumptions are met is a critical demand. And you need to make sure to identify and minimize latencies and jitters in your setup. This can be quite challenging and important as a first step to using triggers. Just to give you one example, so an event is one moment in time, right? Ideally, it should be one instantaneous pulse. However, the amplifier is performing a digitization of the EEG signal, which means it's converting a continuous signal into discrete samples. So when you send a perfect, this idealized pulse, there is a risk that it will not be detected. For example, it could arrive at the receiver between consecutive samples and not be detected at all. So a recommendation is that the minimum pulse width is at least 2 sampling periods. That is, so for example, which could be very small, but it's an important consideration. We have a large variety of resources for you on our support and resources page in our website, and there are many of these resources are listed in the handout, that you can check out at your leisure and on this important topic. And now let us turn to what is in the actual trigger, the information, that is information about what about the what of an event. So first challenge is working with the binary message format. In general, the binary strings can be unintuitive. You know, they are a string of arbitrary symbols, but just because their function does not depend on, you know, their symbolic nature is sufficient, still makes them difficult to work with. So an important solution that has been developed in the use of hardware triggers is to treat binary strings as a number representation. So to give an example, the number of apples could be represented in a decimal format, for example, 5, which, you know, using a decimal representation that goes from 0 to 9. And this is something we all do all the time. And the other is it also can be represented in binary format by the number 101. And the useful utility of this way of thinking about binary as a number representation is we can easily convert between the decimal format, which is familiar and intuitive, and the binary format, which is machine friendly, but not necessarily intuitive for us. And this is a convention that is not theoretically necessary, but it makes it easier and convenient to work with binary information. And this is also very crucial, and the concept that I will spend some time is that it is crucial to define good rules to make your life easy. So let's consider this scenario where the sender and receiver have to communicate information about. Sender has to communicate how many grapes there are to the receiver in decimal code, and, you know, they can count the number of grapes and say 23, as you would in a typical decimal format. And now, how can we know that the receiver actually understood this information? And an easy way to think is that they need to decode this information, and if they can build up a pile of coins or marbles corresponding to what number they heard, and that corresponds to the number of grapes, then they have correctly understood the information that has been received. And when you do this with the decimal system, the first position, number 3, like in the 0 position, represents single units. So 3 it implies there are 3 into 10 to the 0. then the 2 implies that there are 2 groups of 10. And in this way, you can reconstruct a heap of, say, marbles. And if they match, the communication was successful. But what is important to emphasize is that there is a routine calculation, a set of rules that you can perform no matter what the values are coming in, whether they go from 00 to 999. And it is, as long as both sides respect the sender and receiver, follow this convention, it can allow communication to be very successful. And the same idea applies when we use binary encoding, is that suppose you have this, you want to send, again, the sender wants to send this information, and there are 23, but this time it has to be done in binary. There is, again, a routine calculation. Any normal calculator can solve this. For example, the typical Windows or Mac calculator, you usually divide the number 23 repeatedly by 2 and collect all the remainders. So, for example, 23 divided by 2 is 11 with the remainder 1. 11 divided by 2 is 5 with the remainder 1, and you collect all of these remainders. This is the binary representation of 23. And similarly, the receiver can now take this and perform a standard calculation to reconstruct what the quantity was that was sent. And again, the calculation can be performed the same way and can successfully decode information anywhere from 5 zeros to 5 ones. And the reason for stressing this point is this is the same concept to think about when you are using triggers. Is you have a variety of stimuli, you can like the grapes, and you can, in human-friendly terms, assign decimal values to them, which are easier to think about and can be assigned in some systematic way. And then your experimental control software can implement the rules to convert this to binary and send it to the receiver. And these can be decoded back into, again, a human-friendly marker format. And this decoding is done by BrainVision Recorder. And just to give you a flavor for how this is done, this is done via the digital port settings, and this is amplifier specific. So this is the screenshot of what it looks like for the ActiveChamp family. The key information is here, and if we look closely, this information in these yellow boxes indicate how a voltage pulse is to be converted to binary digit. So, for example, a high active is when the decoder says that when the voltage goes up, it's treated as a 1, and no matter where it occurs. And the low active is the other way around. And this can depend on your particular hardware or technology. Again, it's a systematic set of rules that applies no matter what you send across a wide range of inputs. And you can find a colleague of ours, Alex Kreilinger, has written a very nice article that you can get a deep dive into all these various effects of the high active and low active. And this is also in the handout, a link to this. Now, what is crucial here is how do bits turn into markers once they have been converted from voltage pulses into bits. And this information is decided by these rules here. This specifies the bit positions, just like we were talking about grapes. There's a standard positional notation here, and there is an additional feature here called the type, which we'll get to later. And the basic idea is all bits of the same type are simply go through a binary decimal conversion, and then the first letter of the type is attached. So from this binary string, you get a sort of human readable, convenient marker S23. To summarize all this, it's just to say that even though binary is an awkward format for human readability, it's very crucial to tame this by setting up meaningful decoding and encoding rules. And when you set them up properly, it decides the the entire space of inputs and outputs. And just to give you a flavor for this, we will switch to this trigger to marker tool. If you have happened to download it, a link is in the handout. So this is a MATLAB tool, and what it does is essentially a way to help you simulate all possibilities related to this, the effects of setting of these settings, the digital port setting. So it has two windows here, and you can see this looks very much like the digital port settings in Analyzer, and it behaves in the same way. These are modifiable, and what is crucial here is this is the mapping window, is when you have a particular set of decoding rules defined here. This specifies all what will happen for, these are all possible inputs. So 0 to 255 are specified on this left matrix and correspond to each of these inputs. Here it describes all the possible outputs that you can get, all the markers that you can get. And so if you click on one, you can see that if you send the input 119, for these decoding rules, the resulting marker is E119. And you can just click around here and you can see that this is the most, when all of the bits have the same type, this is the most, it gives you the most flexibility. Almost everything can turn into a valid marker, and each marker has a, has a one, they meet the one-to-one criterion, which are marked by black boxes. And the only one that's missing here is the 0, because when you click 0, it sends nothing and there are no markers created. And if you want to clean up this, you just click update. And here you can modify these as you wish, and it will basically simulate what happens for all of these. So this is just to make it very easy to think about what is the effect of the decoding rules that you set up and make it simple to use. So let's go back to the talk here. So the next issue, and a very important one, has to do with the somewhat involved but very important issue, is the confusability of the messages. Due to the way hardware triggers work, what and when can interact in complex ways. And these need to be dealt with. And here's a little example. So there were two senders here, and say just the first one sends this trigger code 1100. The second one sends this shortly after. This shows the pulse width, and as this is the trigger plan. We expect S12 marker to be obtained when you send this, and S6 to be obtained when you send this. This is simply the decimal to binary, binary decimal conversion. This is not no issues here, but because they are coming from different senders, their timings could be different, and it is possible that they can come very close together in time. And as a result, what can happen is they overlap and they interact in complicated ways. So when, for example, for bit 2, 0, 1, 2, both are ones, but they come at slightly different times. So as far as the receiver can tell, there it's like one long pulse, but this is a little bit more complicated for bit 3. Again, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a 1 here and a 0 here. This is going up while the other one is down, but the net effect looks as if there is a pulse. So the receiver receives a trigger code resembling this and is decoded as the marker S14. And this is a crucial error in two ways. Firstly, S14 was not planned, right? And this is the value of the trigger plan right now. Based on all your prior calculations, such things should not occur, but it does. But the second one is that there were two events, but there's just one marker, and there is a missing marker. And this has nothing to do with pulse width that we talked about that can produce missing markers. Here it is a logical consequence of the trigger code choices and their interactions. And this, we can create a confusion matrix from this. Essentially, here is showing, for each of, just to give you a little snippet of this. So imagine that you're sending the trigger code 0010, and these are all possible trigger codes that might be occurring at the same time. So the only time this is correct is when nothing else is happening simultaneously. But when it's 0010 here, and this one is somehow is present at the same time, they overlap and produce a trigger code that is different from either of them. So, and these dark blue show all of the errors here. And to give you to show you the severity of this, this is the full matrix showing all possible interactions for 4 bits. And you can see that they contain several types of errors here. Firstly, for almost all of these, you have a missing marker, right? There are 2 valid trigger codes coming in, but only 1 marker is produced as a result. So there's always 2 events, but only 1 marker. So there are systematic loss of event information. Second is that the same event can have many different markers. So sending a 1001, like you expect a 9, a marker, say S9, but sometimes it can be S11, 13, 15, based on other trigger codes that might be arriving at the same time. So this is a violation, again, of a one-to-one, because one trigger code can result in many possible outcomes. And similarly, many different event types can produce the same marker description. So there's from the marker, you cannot work back and figure out what event produced it, because there's a lot of ambiguity here. Now this looks bad, but and it is a severe problem, especially if you have not accounted for potential interactions like this. But there is a nice solution that is built in with the recorder, the decoding rules to address this. And this is by giving different bits based on their sender identity, different types. So let me explain this again. So for example, let's suppose you have 2 devices, stimulus and response. You assign the first 4 bits, like 0, 1, 2, 3, to the stimulus sender, and these 4 to the response sender. And the net effect is that when you have a string arriving, only these first 4 will be interpreted as being relevant to the stimulus marker, and all the rest being ignored. And similarly, the 4 to 7 will be interpreted as being relevant to the response sender, and all the rest being ignored. So one trigger code can produce 2 markers. In this case, there is no marker. And just to get your head around this, let's quickly look here. Here is a good example. So I'm gonna, again, try to emulate the behavior of the digital port settings. So I have 7 bits. I'm gonna call the first 4 stimulus and the last 4 response, and I update to see what happens. And now what you see that you have 0, these are all possible inputs that can be coming to the receiver, but based on these interpretation rules, you should get 2 different markers. So for example, if I click on 7 here, I will get only 1 marker as 7, because the first 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 bits will correspond to 7. And you can try this here in if you have a binary decimal calculator. Hold on. Wait a minute. Yes. I'm just getting something wrong here. Oh yeah, sorry, I have the wrong. I'm doing a binary to decimal conversion. 0, 1, 1, 1. And you get the decimal value is 7, right? And the other zeros are just ignored. Now, if I go to 112, say this is the input. Now here, the last 4 bits are 0, 1, 1, 1, and this corresponds to 7. So while this might sound confusing, the main idea here is that if these two senders were to send signals at the same time, it will not lead to a missing marker because the first 4 bits and second 4 bits are interpreted independently, and you will correctly get 2 different markers. So 2 different events will produce 2 different markers, and they are well behaved, which was not the case when you don't have suitably set up decoding rules. And what's important is this well behaved, this good behavior is only possible when you select trigger codes that are highlighted here in these black boxes. And you can read more about it in the handout, and also if you have the software and you type help, and you can read more about why this is the case. So so there is a solution, and it's crucial to figure this out. And to select suitable decoding rules and to address the source of code conflicts. And a key issue here is that there's an option called debouncing. That is when you have multiple, say you have a sticky keyboard and you have multiple events that are coming one after the other, you can set up you can enable debouncing that will ignore all of these consecutive events and just take the first. But the risk is that you might have 2 events types, 2 trigger codes that are different, that are coming in very close together, and the second one would be eliminated in the process. So there are many ways that these sender conflicts can occur. For example, they can occur in the sender itself. For example, if a stimulus and a response happen at the same time, the conflict can occur. The sender cannot decide which trigger code to send, and they can overlap in complex ways. So it's crucial to track down the source of this. The third constraint has to do with the number of possible trigger codes. So there are 8 bits. Due to the nature of parallel communication, you cannot send as much as you want. And that means that there are 255 possible trigger codes that can be sent. So the key question is, how many event types do you have and how many do you need so that all the events of interest are suitably captured as trigger codes. So to give you a little example, experiments can have many event types. Here's a laterality task again, just because it's a convenient one. Participants see a picture of a hand and have to decide if it's right or left. So there are 4 possible hand position, positions: palm up, palm down, left, right, and 5 possible orientations. So let's calculate how many stimuli, and so there are 20 possible stimuli here. There are 2 possible responses per trial, right or left, and say these are, each of these trial types are repeated 40 times. So this is 800 trials, and the total number of events is 1600, which is much larger than 255, but this is the number of events. So what is the total number of event types? And now every relevant event should have a marker. So there are, one says naive scheme could be to assign each event a unique marker based on its presentation order. But what you would get is, say, it would be the equivalent of 1600 event types, E1, E2. which is way more than what you have available, like 255 trigger codes. But while it's theoretically possible, this is of low relevance for analysis. Like from these numbers, you cannot know what stimuli were presented, and it may not be informed analysis in any useful way. So general scheme is to group events into types based on the intended analysis. And usually with an experiment design that we showed earlier, the goal is to group together stimuli trial types of the same type in order to enable averaging. And in a sense, essentially, if we consider from that standpoint, there are only 22 unique event types, 20 types of stimuli, 2 types of responses, and every repetition of these will get the same marker. So this allows them all to be aggregated together. And in the final one, it may look a little tricky, is that it's remembered that the event type should not be confused with the bit type, the one that we talked about to separate information from different senders. So if you want to come up with a marker scheme that keeps this factorial structure intact, the first number, say, for example, these are possible markers. The first number might represent, the palm, whether it's up or down, and the second could be whether the hand is left or right. But a potentially equivalent way to do this which is a far more complex one, is to try to get a separate marker for each factor. So every time the stimulus is presented, it generates 2 possible markers, P1 and P2, based on whether the palm was up or down. The problem is that with this structure, you have each event has 2 markers as a result, and it's no longer one-to-one, and it may or may not be helpful during analysis. So in general, the take home here is to design markers based on the analysis goals when possible. So to conclude, the practical tip is use the trigger plan. This is an offline pencil and paper activity to carefully inventory all events and event types, your devices involved, select the digital port settings, and assign trigger codes and marker pairs that meet the one-to-one criterion, and use the trigger to marker tool to find the right combinations until they're complete. And then this can be used to implement and used for piloting. And this helps you identify issues in a more systematic way. And these are the constraints that you have to keep in mind, but they're built into how you would fill in the trigger plan. And to avoid me keeping on talking, let's see if we can have a little quiz to see how you would go about using the one-to-one for error diagnosis. If you observe many missing markers, what would you test first among these different options? So you could enable debouncing, you can change high-low active, you can change the pulse width, you could disable bit, things that we talked about quickly, unfortunately rushed through, but what was your best guess? Okay, so I'll just share the results here. And that's very good. That's what you would do, the first thing you would test is to check the pulse width, because all the others only influence the trigger code, but this can influence essentially whether the marker is present or not. Could you launch the second? One more quick question before we go to the Q&A. Okay, if you observe incorrect and unplanned marker labels, select all the valid options to test. Now in this list, 1 is not correct. Just to give you a clue, what are all the valid ways that could work to try and investigate this issue? Check if the triggers match the high-low active settings. Check if debouncing needs to be enabled or disabled. Check if the triggers are reset before sending a new trigger. Check if the digital port settings match your plan. And you can pick multiple options. It's not just a one correct answer. And there's only one that's incorrect. So I'll just give you another second or so to decide. Okay, and then share the results. All of these are correct except this one, to check if debouncing, because debouncing will eliminate the number of markers, but it won't really influence the marker values itself. So basically, there's a good answer here. So on that note, I will wrap it up here. I've gone a little over time, but there are several resources on our website that I've listed here. And there's a handout. Be sure to download it with a lot of information. And please share your comments and feedback in the post questionnaire so that we can follow up on questions and improve the information that we can provide to you. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Antonia is asking, if you end up using a serial port instead of a parallel port, how does this affect sending the triggers? Does it affect only the speed?
So with if you use a serial port, it would only be for some segment of the journey from the sender to the receiver, because at least the brain products amplifiers expect a parallel port input. It would affect the speed, but it could have other complex combinations. Now, the trigger box, for example, uses a mixture of a serial and a parallel structure. So, for example, it uses a USB, which can have a very high data volume and can be very fast in conjunction with a parallel port. But if you only use a COM port, you might expect complex latency issues. So David, maybe you have some thoughts on this as well, on this question?
I share your explanation. So parallel port is the way to go, because that's really the timing wise, it's the most accurate one. And serial port, out of my experience, is based on operating system, how the hardware piece is communicating with the main board, etc. So you have a few layers in there, and then you should make sure with several tools that the timing is accurate. So yeah. We have also another question. In my experiments, subjects can make errors in their responses. Should I only send triggers for correct responses and skip all the incorrect ones?
So this is a question that I think I've encountered in my own research as well. It's tempting to skip the error responses, but the record of markers is meant to capture where there were events occurring, whether they are correct or wrong. So if you skip the error trials, it looks in your EEG data that nothing happened there. So, and this can be very problematic for analysis where that assumption might actually be false. So to put it briefly, it's very important to send it for both correct and incorrect trials, and to sort this out later during analysis. During acquisition, you want to make sure all context information, as to the extent relevant, is captured, including errors which are reasonably relevant, even if not directly.
Irene asked whether there is a fixed delay between your stimulus presentation software and recorder, and basically how to figure this out.
Yes. Yeah, this is obviously a very good question, and actually the answer is it's not a fixed delay, and it can be very variable based on many factors. And actually Alex here has written an article explicitly about this, so maybe you can say something about this, Alex.
Yeah, so basically, as I already answered as well, but I wanted to follow up, is that the delay caused by this interface is very low. So in theory, it's below 1 millisecond, but it still depends on what kind of stimulus presentation software you are using. So there can be additional delays caused by synchronizing different events, and also, of course, synchronizing the events that are happening on the display and other things that are controlled by this stimulus presentation tool. So it is always good to check this with a kind of true event or link different events that are happening at the same time. And that is explained in the press release, the timing verification test that is linked in the materials. And of course, if you have any question regarding this, we are happy to answer them and send you emails. So please don't hesitate to ask. So yeah, that was the first question. There was another question, if it's always necessary to send 0 triggers or reset 0 triggers to 0 all the time.
So this resetting of 0 triggers, different software, for example, do it differently, whatever their defaults are. And there is no harm in doing it, but there is no set rule. But in general, better to do it than not, because and if you know that it is being reset, then and you can verify that it's in fact the case, then you don't need to do it. That's
exactly. Yeah.
That's the usual thing. So for example, presentation software will reset automatically, but PsychoPy, for example, may not, for example. So
yeah. So sometimes you also have the option to set a pulse and not just an on-off. So it depends again on the presentation tool. That's right. Yeah. So another question, I think we still have time, is so what if there was a mistake in sending triggers in the experiment? Is it somehow possible to recover the correct markers?
This is a question we've all faced in some way or the other, because mistakes do happen. And if so, the big challenge here is that you need a source of ground truth of what actually happened. So even though the timings of the events may be correct, if the marker labels are wrong, how do you know what is correct? And a very good practice, highly recommended in general, is to always, where possible, save a log file whenever you're running your experiment, if possible. Especially standard experiment control software always have the option to save log files. And with those log files, you can at least reconstruct the labels of what was missing. And that's a very good practice in general to do. And if you don't have the log files, this is going to be very difficult. And that's why you must really pay attention to your triggers. So because you can lose a lot of data if you have made mistakes like this.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question, and that was, I think, a quick one. So what can you do if you cannot change the pulse width of a trigger so that it might be too short to be detected?
So the pulse width, as we talked about earlier, this determines whether it can be, if it's too short, you will miss it. And this can sometimes be property for optical triggers, for example, and you may not be able to change it. So one option is actually to use a pulse stretching device. And for example, the trigger box has the option where you can artificially stretch the pulse before it is sent to the amplifier. And maybe Alex, you written an article about this. Maybe you can say something about this as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's much more to say. As you said, sometimes this is necessary, but it comes with additional considerations you should have to take because it changes the nature of the original pulse. So again, please check our resources if you have a trigger source that provides short pulses, and make sure you don't miss any triggers or get the wrong event information while doing that. So yeah, thank you very much, Shiva.
Thank you very much, everyone. And it was a lot of information, and thank you for joining. Please feel free to let us know what you thought in the post-events questionnaire and send us your questions. Thank you very much.